Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to do a follow-up video to my video I did a week ago where I looked at the changing electoral geography of presidential elections since the late 1800s. Today I'd like to follow up on that and look at the shifts from over the last 100-something years that identifies a major shift between Republican and Democrat that was really divided between North and South 100 years ago and longer to very recently, where there has been almost a full shift to the divide being one that is more urban and rural, or urban and educated versus rural and less educated. And so we're going to go into detail on that in this video today. Okay, so first off, I'm going to have some of the same maps that I used in my last video, but also going to be using and showing you some maps of county level data, because to understand the division between urban and rural is very important to look at county level data. So this map I had last time, this is a map that goes from 1888, shows the outcome of presidential elections between 1888 and I actually have it all to 2012, but this page ends at 1948. And of course, as you can see, many Western states in 1888 were not states, they were still just territories, and so they did not actually have presidential electoral votes. And of course, that was even still the case all the way up until 1912, or was the first year where all lower 48 states had electoral votes. So, from Reconstruction in the post-Civil War era, which 1988 kind of begins a little bit after that, but all the way through 1928, okay, here's 1932, 1928, we can see that in most, for every 4 years, there was a clear division between the southern states and the northern states. The northern states were Republican, the southern states were Democrat. Back then, the Democrats, of course, were the party of slavery, well, before the Civil War, and then afterwards, segregation and Jim Crow and a lot of those things. And that's pretty well understood, of course, whereas the Republicans were the abolitionist party with Ronald Reagan. Now, as time went on past Reconstruction, that the Republican Party really started to become more of a associated, I guess, kind of with like sort of the industrialization that and Gilded Age and in the northern states. But in any case, the legacy and effects of the Civil War really led to a division that lasted, like I said, almost every 4 years. Again, you'd see a divided North and South. So again, that era was absolutely, the Democrats were the ones that were continuing the racial segregation and the racial injustices of the time, certainly. Now, that really started, you saw a big sweeping change in 1932, and that, of course, is the election of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This was the Great Depression, and by this time, the Democrats were, of course, understanding that that they can use bureaucracy and use the federal government to for programs to help people in the Great Depression. You know, you had the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Work Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, beginnings of Social Security, and much more. Now, some of that actually even kind of started a little bit during the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1912 and 1916, where you kind of wanted to also sort of a landslide there. Wilson, in many ways, was a foreshadowing of FDR, in that they were both wartime presidents. They kind of came from wealthy families, and they were more about, you know, the federal government expansion to make the country a better place, basically, you know. So, yeah, you can see that FDR was hugely popular. However, the big, strong holdout that was not a big fan of FDR was northern New England. Ironic, because this is the region that today, of course, has been Democrat since the late 80s. So those northern New England states, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And generally speaking, you can see New England was very red. The whole rest of the country was blue. Now, you can also see, however, though, from the 1930s to the 1940s, the last two elections of FDR, he was still very popular, still won by landslides, but a little bit less so. Across the northern part of the country, especially the Plain states, you can see that, discontent might have been growing with FDR. Probably maybe because the Depression dragged on. Also, before Pearl Harbor, getting into World War II was really actually kind of a pretty divisive issue. So anyways, that's up through the World War II era. So FDR really shifted and really kind of began the era where the Democrats are associated more with the major federal government programs to alleviate poverty and inequality and things like that. So, but what you can see, though, is that the post-World War II era was really the beginning of the shift that's where the southern states started to become Republican. But it was only just barely. In 1948, this is the first election of Truman, and this is the very first time ever that the Deep South voted Republican. Okay, literally the very first time ever. I don't know too much of what was going on during that time, but my understanding is that Harry Truman was a little bit more progressive on racial equality, I guess, compared to some of his contemporaries, but I don't know a lot of the detail, but it clearly is a sign. So again, those states are red. Now, in the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, it kind of went back to sort of its original pattern where the southern states were Democrat. But then the 60s came and then things really started to change. Alabama and Mississippi over here just decided to have their own party at the time, okay? I think it was the Dixiecrats, but, and then the 1964 was really the first year where you could see the Deep South turns red. The whole rest of the country became blue. And again, LBJ in many ways was really kind of was the capstone on the idea that the Democrats were now going to be the party of helping African Americans. He got the Civil Rights Act passed and the Voting Rights Act passed, and then came the Fair Housing Act, and throughout later in the 60s, and this really caused a big shift. Okay, and in 1968, of course, George Wallace won the Deep South states. Again, they were independent. Okay, so they were not Republican or Democrat. It's not necessarily the last time that the Deep South, stays, turned blue, because it did in 1976, which with Carter, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the big shift, of course, that I was talking about was the South going from Democrat to Republican. Another interesting shift, though, is that, even well into the late 80s, 1988, over here, you can see that northern New England and Vermont, which is today kind of considered the most liberal or left-wing state in the country, but it is also one of the most rural and one of the most white, which kind of goes against what a lot of people might assume about states that are predominantly overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly rural. Now, the reason for that, of course, is something I touched on in my last video. You do have seen an exodus, various waves of exodus since the 1960s of those who are from cities that may have more progressive ideas, but also want to get back to nature, want to have a simpler life, and of course, Vermont, and to a lesser extent, Maine and New Hampshire, for the last 50 years, has seen an exodus from people from New York City, from Boston, that want the simpler life closer to nature, but still hold some more progressive values. And that's pretty well understood why, again, you can see that northern New England is red, even well into the 80s, but ever since then it's been blue. And again, this is certainly represented very much by Bernie Sanders, who's originally from Brooklyn, but then moved to Vermont and then became mayor of Burlington and then ultimately a senator. So a few other things to point out. So yeah, you do, just like in the same way that FDR won landslide victories throughout the country in the 1930s, in the 1970s and 80s, Nixon and then Reagan won landslide victories in their respective decades. So 1972, 49 state landslide. The only state that he didn't win was Massachusetts, where his competitor was from. And in 1984, same thing with Mondale. Only Minnesota is the only state he won because that's where he's from. So again, I mentioned that this is probably partly backlash to the increasingly radical ideas stewing around in the 60s. But also, I think people were generally getting tired of too much government regulation. Basically, well into the 70s, the New Deal era of the 30s really was still remained to be the core of federal policy, of a lot of federal bureaucracy to help people. Reagan, of course, was all about deregulation, and at that time, that clearly was popular, not universally, but yeah, even the states that he won, and just because you have a landslide victory as far as states doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it's universally popular, okay? But you can certainly see, again, even, you know, these from 1972, 1976, 1980, and then this is George Bush the First, George Bush Sr., also really won in a landslide. So, again, one of the really big anomalies here that really kind of doesn't fit any of the other patterns is 1976, the election of Carter. This is really one of the really only times where you saw a big divide between East and West. Like, Carter won most of the states in the East, and Ford won most of the states in the West. Again, you know, maybe there was something about Nixon and Ford that maybe people in the West liked better, and people like in the East like Carter better. I really don't know, but it really is kind of an anomaly. And again, I pointed out last time that the 90s are really an interesting period. The 90s were, of course, you know, when Clinton won both terms. He won a plurality of the popular vote, but not necessarily the majority, because I guess I believe Ross Perot, the independent, won a decent amount to kind of split the vote. But what you really can see, it's not the pattern that we see today that really started in 2000, because Clinton still won a lot of rural states, including in the South, which have been solidly Republican ever since 2000. Again, he is a white guy from the South that might have played a role, but he also really won full support, though, from all the typical Democrat states that we know of today. Really solidly won the Northeast, really solidly won the Midwestern states, except for Indiana here, which has long been a solidly Republican state, as well as the entire West Coast here, okay? So, still won a lot of states that are rural and that are not what a lot of people today would be considered hotbeds of progressivism, but at the same time, he did win those states in the Northeast and West Coast. And so this kind of goes to show that a president can easily, again, whatever you think of Bill Clinton, that a state can a candidate can still appeal to the issues of people that are in coastal cities while still winning big majorities in more rural states with weaker, with less strong economies, basically at the time. Now, let's talk a little bit now. Let's take a look at some of the county level maps. So now we're going to look at some of the county level maps because, again, as we can see, there's a big shift from urban to rural. Now, what's interesting, so I'm going to show you this map here. This is the 2008 map. This is the first election of Barack Obama. And what you can see is that even well into only a little over 10 years ago, there were still areas of the country that were rural, that are not areas that where wealthier, more educated, more progressive city folk move to, but are just simply rural, you know, where the economy is still based around agriculture and things like that, but still voted Democrat, even for in the both Obama elections. And you really see that in, again, the upper Midwest, particularly Minnesota and Wisconsin. Northern Minnesota, like the Iron Range area, where they do iron mining, is very much a Democrat stronghold, very much a Union stronghold. And that's, of course, the kind of working class Union segment of the population has long been sort of the core of the Democratic Party, but slowly as time has gone by, that's become less dependable. The Democrats have been reaching out to them a little bit less, but you can certainly see that Iowa, Illinois, and again, far from Chicago, and all over Wisconsin and Minnesota, you can see that this is still an area that is rural and majority white, but still one, okay? New England too, for sure, okay? Although, again, New England, the northern New England states, however, has seen a bit more of an exodus from places like New York and Boston into these states than, I mean, certainly people from like Chicago and Detroit certainly moved to Minnesota and Wisconsin, but not really quite to the same level, okay? So, now what other areas are there that are rural and blue? So certainly there's still areas of the Deep South over here, and over here that are solidly Democrat, and that still is the case. This is the 2016 map showing margin of victory. Even in 2016, 4 years ago, still big areas of blue here. Well, why is that? Those are areas of the South that's where African Americans make up, if not the majority, certainly a plurality, okay? They, of course, are, have deep roots there. These areas, back from the era of slavery, this area, of course, is some of the most agriculturally productive and fertile lands. Like this is the Mississippi Delta. That's like where the blues, started. So even though Mississippi is a solid red state, the rest of the state really outvotes this area. And same thing with Alabama. This is the black belt of Alabama because you have black soil, and same thing with the fertile lands of the Mississippi alluvial plain there, and also here into the Carolinas. So again, people have just been living there ever since, before the 1800s, their ancestors. So. And that's so the main areas today, as we're going to see here, a lot of that area of blue in rural states in the upper Midwest has largely disappeared. There's a few little areas here in Wisconsin and again in northern Minnesota too, but yeah, for the most part, the Democrats really within only a decade, that was sort of the last area of areas that are rural and white that are not a product of educated progressive city folk going back to nature, like you would see in Vermont, or the way you'd see in maybe some parts of the Colorado Rockies and places like that. And of course, another big area that is blue and rural are many areas of, this is the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, okay? And then of course, Arizona and New Mexico. So all of this area here is areas that are majority or plurality Hispanic Latino. Okay, so we can see that there has been a big loss of the area, especially in the Midwest. And also here you can see that Ohio, which has long been a bellwether state, you can see that the states, the counties here in northeastern Ohio, all blue during Obama's first term. And even some of the smaller cities, like this is right over here, is Dayton, Ohio. Now, in 2012, same thing. Ohio, again, pretty much all across the northern sector of Ohio, and that's Dayton over there. But then you go and look at 2016, it's largely, they lost a lot of that, and basically the only blue areas you see are exactly where the major cities are of Cleveland, Columbus, at Cincinnati. So they lost Dayton. So Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati are big enough to have a bit of a critical mass of educated white-collar city people, whereas Dayton is not. And so again, the more urban and more educated they are, the more you're going to see the voting Democrat, and vice versa. Now, a lot of people sort of think, does that necessarily mean that smarter people vote Democrat today? No, that's not really what it is. What it is that it has probably more to do with the fact that those who are more educated are more likely to have jobs that are more secure from outsourcing, more secure from automation. Not entirely secure, certainly, maybe more secure from economic cycles. So, whereas those who are less educated have jobs that are more prone to automation, more prone to outsourcing, and therefore are going to feel more economic insecurity. So, again, this is the 2016, so it's basically cities, counties that have cities. They're basically counties that have college towns, and generally areas where people have either retired from cities that are more progressive and more educated, that have gone into places. Again, it really changes the electoral patterns of northern New England. Not so much in the West, because Western states are really big, and with the massive landmass of the Western states, people can still retire or move to a more bucolic setting, and for hours around, they're still in the same state. Again, I mean, certainly there's been migration from California to other Western states where it's more affordable, but still, nonetheless, though, is particularly noticed in northern New England. So, some conclusions are that we've seen in relatively short period of time, there has been a full division geographically, that what used to be a division between northern Republican states, southern Democrat states, that started to shift with the first big shift was, of course, with FDR, that won landslide victories in the 1930s and 40s during the Great Depression and World War II. Starting in the post-World War II era, you saw the shift, the South starting to go Republican with, the Civil Rights era, the Civil Rights movements and the Civil Rights Act and related acts. The 1964 Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson was really a big turning point. And then after that, you had some anomalies like the 1976 election, again, where Carter won, and kind of seeing the first time kind of an East-West division. But again, still into the 90s, Clinton was able to get the coastal progressive cities as well as more rural southern states, which have been solidly red since 2000, and even the Midwestern rural states like Iowa, haven't gone blue since Obama's second term. So, and again, the only rural areas that again are blue are mostly places where people have from cities that have moved to. They could be college towns, or they could just be very scenic, beautiful areas like Vermont or whatever, and then areas that are rural but majority minority. The African-American region of the South, Mississippi Delta, and then parts of the Southwest that are majority Hispanic and Latino. Although even some of those areas like in Texas are also starting to maybe turn red too. This last election saw a couple counties on the Rio Grande Valley turn red. Okay, so hopefully that was, you found that interesting. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover. And so with that, I hope all of you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. My next video, I plan on being about public lands in the U.S., so check that out. I should have that for about a week or so from now. With that, have a great Sunday, and I'll see you next time. Bye.